Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. So today I'm going to be continuing this drawing of Clary that I was working on, and I'm going to be showing you how to draw light and curly hair in graphite. So whenever I'm drawing curly hair, the first thing that I like to do is I go in and I start to section it off into smaller sections than I might if I was doing straight hair. The reason why I like to do this is because for curly hair, there's so much change in direction, and it's a lot easier if you're working in smaller sections to make sure that you're keeping that flow of the hair. When you're drawing hair, the one thing to keep in mind that makes it a lot more realistic is that you want to make sure that every section is following the correct direction. If the hair doesn't look like it's flowing properly, then it won't look as realistic and it'll kind of get a messy feeling, and it just won't look like it's flowing from the top of the person's head down to the bottom. So I like to work in smaller sections for that reason on curly hair, because there are so many changes in direction. It just makes it easier to make sure that you're keeping the correct flow in each little section. So this technique that I'm going to show you for drawing lighter hair can be applied to any lighter hair color. It doesn't necessarily have to be blonde. It could be a light red, like Clary's hair here is a light red color. It could also be a very light brown color. This technique would work just as well for any of those colors. You just have to make sure that you tweak it slightly depending on your reference photo. So you may have to make the shadows a little bit darker. You might have to make them a little bit lighter if the color that you're trying to achieve is lighter than what I was going for here. So one thing to remember when trying to draw realistic hair is having a reference photo will really help you make sure that it does look as realistic as possible. That way you can check against your reference photo and see whether or not you're getting the right tones in every single little area. I also find that especially when you're drawing in graphite, it's really helpful to make sure that you convert your reference photo to black and white. It's fine if your original reference photo is in color, but you want to make sure that when you're drawing in graphite, you're getting the different tones that you're looking for. And because it's monochromatic, you want to make sure that what you think is dark blonde is actually you're drawing the right darkness to it. So if you convert your photo to black and white, then you'll really be able to see what those different tones of gray look like, as opposed to just trying to guess from a colored reference photo. So whenever I'm drawing a lighter hair color, I always start out with an H pencil and I just go in and put a very light base layer. Just like when drawing skin, you want to make sure that you do get some color on the paper so you don't have the white of the paper showing through, but you still want to make sure that those highlights you're going to have are very light, so you don't want to darken the paper too much to start with. After I put in that first layer, I then blend it out, and then I go back in with that H pencil again and I start adding in some of those darker little shadows. When you're drawing light hair, you don't want to start out too dark with those shadows because it'll make the overall look of the hair way too dark. So I always go in with that H pencil to get those shadows to start with. It's always better to have to build up those shadows than to go in too dark to start with, and then you might have to go in and erase, and then you run into issues of potentially damaging the paper and just making the overall look of the hair not what you're going for. So I always start very light with my shadows and continue to build them up as I go. Another tool that I really like to use when drawing light hair especially is the Mono Zero eraser. So after every single time I blend out, I take that Mono Zero eraser and I pull out some of the highlights that I want in the hair. Especially with light hair, you want to make sure that your highlights are staying very, very light. If those highlights start to get too dark as you're drawing, then the overall look of the hair will be darker. So I always go in and pull them out every time. That way the hair is still getting a blended look and you're still getting those highlights. I find that if you try to blend around those highlights, then it sometimes gets a disjointed look and it doesn't look like it's the same section of hair. It makes it look like there's this weird part on top. But if you can use the mono zero eraser, or if you have a kneaded eraser that you can mold into a smaller tool to use, then that will work as well. But you want to make sure that the portions of highlight that you're pulling out with that mono zero eraser are very thin and represent more smaller clumps of hair as opposed to larger sections, and it will give it a more realistic look. For each section, I continue darkening the shadows, blending and pulling out those highlights until I get it about 90% of what I want it to end up looking like before I move on to the next section. So once I get the section that I'm working on about 90% done, then I move on to the next section. The reason why I do this is because sometimes you might think that you have one section the way that you want it to look, and then when you start to do the section next to it and the paper next to it is no longer white, the contrast that you're looking for isn't what you had. And I find that it's better to have it be a little bit lighter than you think it'll end up being, so that you don't have to go back and erase things that you've already done. So I usually will end up going back and darkening some of those shadows as I work on other sections. By not making it 100% the way that I want it to be, it allows me to go back and do that without having to darken the overall look of the hair and make it not look the color that I want it to be. So one really important thing to remember when you're drawing curly hair especially is that anytime you have a piece of hair crossing over another, that hair is going to cause shadows in the part that's underneath, and you need to make sure that you're kind of showing that gradient of shadows. Otherwise the hair will look like it's on the same plane and it won't have that three-dimensional look that the curl creates. So for this section here, you can see I'm darkening right where those two sections meet, and that will create the look that that outside portion is going underneath the part that's coming across. This type of shadowing is really important in curly hair because it really shows that the curls are three-dimensional and not just squished flat. And in this section here, it also helps show the curvature of the head, which is also really important when drawing hair, to make sure that you're showing the fullness of that shape. If you don't show that curvature in the hair, it will make it look like the person doesn't have the right skull shape underneath the hair, and it will make it not look as realistic, and it'll give an overall flat look. So as I'm continuing here with the lower part of the hair, I'm just repeating the same processes that I was doing up top. The only difference here is that I actually started working in even smaller sections because there was a lot of curls. So I wanted to make sure that each curl I was following the correct direction. So I put in some of those darker shadows first actually on this bottom section here, and then I went back in and followed the same thing, putting in that H pencil, going back and darkening those shadows, blending, and then pulling out those highlights. The important thing to remember when you're getting into the smaller curls is to keep that darkness for the part of the curl that's in shadow, and making sure that you are pulling out a lot of those highlights on the part of the curl that's most being hit by the light. That will give you that real curl effect and will make it overall look very realistic. So another thing to remember when you're drawing hair is that you don't actually have to show every single hair. What I normally like to do is just make sure that my pencil strokes are following the flow of the hair in that section. And then when you blend it out and you continue to go back and have those pencil strokes in that same direction, it will create an overall look that there is the individual hairs there. If you think about it, your eyes don't actually pick up every single hair when you're looking at a picture. So you want to make sure that the overall look of this section is the direction that the hair should be going, and you will be able to achieve that realistic look. What I like to do is, once I've finished up a section, what I like to do is take my Mono Zero eraser and put in some stray hairs that go in completely different directions than the rest of the hair, and that will also help to achieve that overall realistic look, because nobody's hair is perfectly all together all at once. So you're always going to have one or two little stray hairs. So by going in and putting those stray hairs over the section that you've drawn, it'll give that more realistic look, and it will then give you the look that you have drawn in every single hair, even though you haven't. So here I just continue darkening those shadows and blending and pulling out those highlights until I got the overall look that I wanted. And I continued to go back in the sections I had already worked on to make sure that I was keeping a consistent contrast throughout the whole thing. So as you can see, as I was finishing up that side of the hair, I really did go in and darken up some of those shadows. In some of those areas, I actually did use a 6B and an 8B pencil to get the darkness that I was looking for. And that's one of the things that is really important to making hair look more realistic, is getting those really dark spots where there really will not be any light showing through. And even though the overall look of the hair that you're going for is very light, there are going to be spots where you do want that contrast to be really high. Having that contrast there will make it look very realistic. One trick that I found to make that contrast look even better is if there's a really dark portion that you want to have, if you pull out a highlight right next to it, it will make the two next to each other will make that contrast look even better, and it will help you to not have to darken the overall look of the hair that you're drawing, but you will still get that really drastic contrast, and it will make the whole thing look more realistic. So that's it for today's hair tutorial. I hope that it was helpful for you guys. Next week, I'm going to be doing a drawing with dark, straight hair so you can see the differences between dark and light hair and straight and curly hair. I hope that you found this tutorial helpful, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for future tutorials. And if you have any other questions about how to draw light and curly hair, go ahead and put them in the comments and I'll try to answer them for you as soon as I can. Bye guys!